Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to Full Circle with Tessa Dooms. This is our first show for 2023. We're starting off a little later in the year than we had expected, but we're starting off with a really important conversation. The conversation is youth unemployment must fall. And as usual on the show, we're dealing with contemporary issues, we're dealing with political issues, and we're making the political very personal here. We are a show about making sure that we're informed about what's happening in our country, but then we also think about what is the impact on policies and politics on our very own lives. And so this week, the Stats SA, the Statistics South Africa, they put out the report, a quarterly report that they always put out every 3 months or so, that tell us where we in terms of job numbers in the country. So this week we found out that actually our unemployment rate has gone down. This is the second quarter in a row, I think it is, that we've seen our unemployment figures going down. So we were at 34%, we've gone down to 33%, and now we're at about 32% unemployment. But we need to figure out what that number actually means, and particularly what it means in the lives of young people. Many young people in this country hear that, unemployment is going down, which must mean somebody's getting employed. But for many young people, that's not them. It's not their lives that's affected, and they're still struggling. People say, I don't know where I'm going to get a job or how I'm going to get a job because the future doesn't look bright for many. So this morning I wanted to tackle that, make sense of the statistics, and I've brought in a few experts with me today. So Duma and Lethiwe, thank you so much for joining me. So Duma, you've worked in this area for a long, long time around looking at not only job numbers, but the economy as a whole. And Lethiwe, you're from Youth Capital, and you guys focus on youth unemployment. Yep. So I want to start with just kind of your reflections as people who've worked and looked at these numbers many, many times over now, on when you saw the new job numbers. What came to mind for you? So Duma, let's start off with you.
Thank you for the invite, and it's really nice to meet Lethiwe in person. We are always on these Twitter spaces of Youth Capital. It's an amazing organization that I support in everything they do, and Youth Lab as well, who also, they're very involved in the space. But just the first thing that came to mind, Tessa, is that for 30 years, 3 decades, the government has mismanaged this economy. They've not managed to create jobs for South Africans and young people. That's the first thing that came to mind. How can you get it so wrong for 3 decades and nothing happens? So I look at long-term trends in terms of unemployment. That's what I've started doing, is that so roughly the job creation correlates with the growth of the economy. I was telling Lethiwe. So there have been 4 phases in terms of our economy since 1994. So the first phase was what I call the gear phase, where the government implemented this economic policy where they were cutting spending on consumption and infrastructure to balance the budget. So that is from 1996 to 2003. Our economy didn't do very well. The unemployment has obviously went up from, now there's 3 labor force surveys over the past 29 years. There was something under apartheid called the October Household Survey until about 2000, and it was only once a year. And then there was something called the Labor Force Survey, which was twice a year. And then later on, there was what we now call the Quarterly Labor Force Survey. So when you make comparisons between those, they're not directly comparison. But despite that, unemployment was 33% in 1996, and I never referred to the official definition. I only referred to the expanded definition.
So tell us the difference between the official definition and the expanded definition for people who don't know.
Yes, so the expanded definition includes what is called discouraged work seekers. People don't have the transport. Youth Capital has done work. It costs about 1,000 rands for people to do all the work, the photocopying, the transport. People can't look for work because they just don't have the means to look for the jobs. And there's also apartheid spatial development. It's far for you to get from wherever to go and look for where the jobs are. Because, so those are the type of reasons. So
when somebody's a discouraged work seeker, they don't then fit into that 32% number. What's the expanded definition number?
Okay, so the expanded definition is 11.9 million South Africans are unemployed, and the unemployment rate is 43%. Yeah,
that's a whole 10% higher.
Yes,
it's actually 11.
Yeah, and then if you disaggregate by race, which I always do. So the youth one is 70%,
Jeez.
and 15 to 24. And then if you look at race, African people, it's about 47.6, and then African females, it's about above 50%. So so almost half of African people are unemployed.
And up to 70% of young people.
Young people between 15 and 20. So for what you're asking that. So for me, like, how can you, as the government, do nothing about this for 30 years? So from 1996 to 2003, March, it went from 33% to 40.6%. That's during the gear phase. Then there was a boom in the economy between 2004 and 2008, Thabo Mbeki boom. We used to shout jobless growth. But now what?
I'm old enough to remember that.
Yeah. I was with President Mbeki towards the end of last year, and I told him, I used to shout jobless growth. But when I was doing this research, I asked Stats SA, amazing people who work there, I don't want to see your official definition. I want you to give me a set of stats that only show the expanded definition. So a lady called Malerato, she worked on it for 2 weeks, and she gave me the stats, And the funny thing is that I was on an Al Jazeera show some time ago, and they do fact checks, Where do you get these numbers from, They're not the official numbers. So I said, then I realized the penny dropped. I'm the only person who has these numbers.
Wow.
But anyway, so we created 3 million jobs between March 2003 and December 2008 during the boom. 3.1 million.
So between March 2003
September,
and September?
No, and December.
In December?
Yeah, sorry, in December 2008, we created 3.1 million jobs.
Goodness.
Now, just to become very important, so half of those jobs were for young people, 1.4 million jobs.
So that's like 3 million jobs in a 5-year period.
In a 5-year period, yeah. So this is a lot of jobs that we created. Unemployment rate came down from 40%, 40.6 to 28.7%. Now, I talked to Paddy Lehotla. There's some anomaly in the data. So to understand unemployment numbers, you have to look at the growth of the labor force. That's the supply side driver. So what I noticed during this period is that the labor force wasn't growing very fast. So that also helped bring down the unemployment rate. So I asked Dr. Paddy, I said, now what is going on? Like, we can speculate. He says, well, I'm not sure, but might have been the AIDS deaths. So the labor force was not growing as fast as it usually does. So it was growing at about 1% a year during that period. But then obviously we made gains in terms of antiretroviral drugs, and the relationship was restored during the next period. So the last period, the 2009 to 2019, it's what I call a lost decade. So during the last decade, our GDP per person did not grow, and obviously the numbers of unemployment went through the roof. So the last thing I want to say in terms of that scenario, so when you look from December 2008, remember the low point in the post-apartheid period, to the end of December 2022. Now, I like looking at annual figures. That's why I get excited. I don't like quarterly figures. So basically, the labor force grew by 7 million people from 20.7 to 27.8 million people.
So that's the people who could work.
No, the people who joined the labor force. So now, the labor force is growing by about 600 to 700,000 people a year. So we must create jobs for all those people
every year,
and the people who were previously unemployed. So
that's, I mean, roughly we're talking about between 700,000 and 1 million jobs need to be created a year.
Yeah, just to stop the numbers from increasing. And you must remember that in December 2008, there were 5.9 million unemployed. So now, during this period, December 2008 to December 2022, we created 1.2 million jobs.
So in over a decade, we created
1.2 million jobs.
In 15 years, we created 1.2 million jobs. Whereas before, in 5 years, we had created 3 million jobs.
Yeah.
Wowza.
So now the unemployment numbers increased by 6 because the labor force is growing by 7. We created 1.1, 1.2. And then, so those are the drivers at a macro level in terms of the last thing before Lethiwe comes in is that this is the one that disturbed me when I was talking before we came into the studio, because I always look at the macro picture. I don't look at youth, but now I'm looking at youth. And if you unpack that 1 million, we created 2 million jobs for people aged 35 to 64, and 1 million youth lost their jobs.
Goodness.
So now, that was the most depressing thing. I didn't know what to say.
That's a good segue into Lethiwe and your work at Youth Capital. So, coming from the point of view of working with young people, often on the issues of unemployment and really trying to think about policy solutions. So, when you saw these job numbers, which I now find to be rather horrific, because I mean, when the president or anybody speaks about these job numbers and says, "Oh, we're having, we've had a good quarter, we've, grown," that historical picture does not say to us we've grown. And in fact, I'm starting to think we need to know how many more young people have become part of the discouraged work seekers,
Right.
part of that 11% gap between, the 32% and
sure,
that
yeah.
43%. So how do you respond to that, and how are young people responding to hearing that, apparently things are better?
It's quite upsetting when young people hear that things are better, because the reality is things are not better. The numbers that were released confirm that the interventions that have been created by the government are not able to curtail the issue of youth unemployment. We hear of youth employment programs that are supposedly labeled as jobs, and they're not, because what they do is they provide a young person with a work experience for a year. Right, so yes, a young person is active in the economy, is able to contribute to the economy, is employed, quote unquote, employed. But when that year ends, they're back at looking for work. So then they become part of the number of young people that are unemployed. So what we see is the scenario of a revolving door. Right. And so young people don't see themselves as being, like they don't see that they're being seen as valuable, because they're not given opportunities that are equipping them with the skills to ensure that when the opportunity ends, they're able to apply for other opportunities, that there's actually a next for them.
Let's talk a bit about that youth employment network of interventions by government. The YES program was one of the big ones that people might know about, and a lot of other youth interventions. When I was in the National Planning Commission, we did research that showed there were about 4,000 youth employment programs in the country, programs that were supposed to be working for young people. What's going wrong with the kind of programs? So just talk us through not necessarily naming all the programs,
Right.
but what is the characteristics of these programs, these, that are trying to help young people, and where are some of those failures in terms of young people's experiences?
I think one area or explanation to what's going, why they're not working, is there isn't a clear pathway. Right.
Okay.
So let's take, for example, the Basic Education Employment Initiative, where many young people were employed to become teacher assistants.
Oh, yeah. So the program that government put in place that brings in young people, I think at 3,500, and they
Right.
go and be teacher assistants for a few months. Yeah.
Exactly, right? So let's take that opportunity, that intervention, as an example. There you have young people who, and in fact, I've spoken to a couple of them who've told me that experience made them realize that they actually would like to qualify as teachers. They'd like to be in the profession and grow in the profession. That opportunity left young people, not having the skills to even become a teacher, because a lot of them that I spoke to would tell me that the work they would do was not necessarily equipping them with the knowledge on how to become a good teacher, right? So essentially what I'm saying is that the skills that young people acquire during these programs are skills that do not match the skills needed in the labor market, right?
Yeah.
And so and then also there isn't a clear pathway as to where else can a young person go post this opportunity. We know that, for example, we have a crisis in our literacy in our country, right, where we have young people, kids actually, not even young people, but kids in grade 4 and 10 unable to read for meaning, right? And that means that we have to nip this issue at the bud by ensuring at early development that a kid is able to start reading for meaning. So what I'm saying, therefore, is that a young person who was a teacher assistant could be equipped to actually work in the ECD sector and equip those learners so that,
Right.
you know what I mean? So there's a pathway from being a teacher assistant to now working as an ECD practitioner. But those pathways don't exist.
So you're painting the picture, and it's the one in the youth development sector that we've been starting to realize over the years is a problem, where people are getting into opportunities when they can get them.
Yeah.
But they're not going from those opportunities, those short-term opportunities, into long-term employment. unemployment. And so that 32% or 43% unemployment actually can just escalate in a matter of a few months, because people who are counting themselves as employed today may not be employed next month or the month thereafter, because there's not actually a pathway for them to go anywhere. But then what is the point of continuing to have these programs? Is there a reason why government and even private sector are doing these programs if young people are saying they're not getting them where they need to go?
You know, I think I want to quote a classic saying: "Don't throw the bath water with the baby."
Yes.
Right. So, I say that to say that the programs have potential to work. The fact that I'm saying that young people are not getting the skills means that they can be better designed to ensure that young people do get the skills. Right. We hear the president speak about private and public partnership. So, how do we ensure that that partnership translates in a way that private sector can then employ young people who are part of public employment programs? I'll give another example just to demonstrate this point. We've heard about the many digital jobs created at Home Affairs, so young people could digitize the process at Home Affairs, right? Now, imagine if tech companies were able to have a say into what kind of skills a young person who's part of that program, what kind of skills are they getting, and can those skills be viable, used in their tech companies at an entry-level job, And that's what I mean by intentional partnership between the public sector and the private sector. So there is purpose in these programs if they're designed well, if they're designed in such a way that they're intentional in giving young people the skills, but not only just the skills. I want to highlight another potential benefit from these programs, and that is providing young people with the social capital. We know that young people often struggle to find opportunities because they don't know who to speak to that can point them to the right door. Right. But now when they work, they get exposed to people that they can connect to, who can write reference letters, for example. I think there's potential in these programs, so there is a need for them, but they need to be designed in such a way that they prepare young people for the next.
Yeah, and so there must be a next in these program designs. I want us to get back a little later to the question of social capital, because I think it's a really, really important one. But Duma, just thinking about that pathway, right, and this revolving door that many young people are now facing of going into, one internship, another internship, one short-term opportunity, another short-term opportunity. Let's talk a little bit about the demand side versus the supply side. Because when it comes to labor, the demand side is often focused on, or the supply side is often focused on the young people themselves. And are they ready? Are they equipped? Do they have the skills? But the demand side, what's happening there? Do we actually have jobs in this country, right? I wrote a piece in the Sowetan a few weeks ago that says, we're not a poor nation. We're a nation of poor people. Because I can't believe that given the kinds of wealth that we do have in this country, that there's just simply no opportunity out there. So what's happening on the demand side? Is there simply no jobs, or are our young people just not equipped for them?
That's an excellent question. I once evaluated TSAPO 1 million, which is the Gauteng government program.
Yeah.
And I remember going to El Dorado Park.
Where I'm from.
To the job center with my colleague Chantal. And we sat there. People have to load their CVs. The reality, Tessa and Lethiwe, there are no jobs. You're raising the hopes of the young people that they go there and they work in the lab, get their CV ready, and there are no jobs. And
what explains that? What explains there not being jobs?
The demand side. So over this period of 15 years that I was telling you, 1 million young people lost their jobs.
Right.
And the older people were taking the jobs. So it was the younger people's. I don't understand. Younger people suffered during this period, but during the earlier period I talked about, young people benefited. So I don't understand why during this period since December 2008 we are seeing the opposite in terms of that. Yeah.
So at a practical level.
At a practical level, at a macro level, there are no jobs. Yeah.
So does that mean that we don't have enough big companies that can, employ people? Are we scaling down in terms of our economic activity? Or is it that big companies would rather have fewer workers? Is it because technology is taking the jobs? I mean, what's happening at the level of kind of big companies and, you know, the job creators? Why aren't they there?
Okay, so there's a survey that I like looking at Status-A. It's called the Manufacturing Utilization Survey. So they do a survey of large industrial companies. So generally, companies are operating at about, during COVID it was worse, but it's about 80% of their capacity. And the reason they give, we can produce much more than we're producing now, but people don't have the money to buy the things that we want to produce. So they say the number one issue is not skills. They say so repeatedly in every survey. The number one issue is lack of demand for the things. So now, so lack of demand. So this is why I've been talking a lot about what we must do to boost the demand side. And one of the issues I talk about a lot is the basic income grant, you know. And we should also be talking, so we need to do a lot of things. And what people need to understand is that there's no one initiative that is good, that will solve this problem. We are talking about many initiatives that must work together. The basic income grant that I've been working on for 2 years.
So wait, before you explain the basic income grant, because I want us to explain that properly, I just want to go a little bit back in what you were saying. So you're saying that young people lacking skills is not the thing.
It's not the thing.
Or experience, because that's also what young people have been told. You don't have the skills, you don't have the experience. I saw a tweet this morning
Tessa,
saying...
I used to be an employer, and I had a policy. I do not want you to have skills. I'm hardcore on this thing. I'm there to teach you the skills.
Absolutely. Build your own timber.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. Like, it is unreasonable during an interview to say, you know, where have you done this work before? And I had a policy. I would not, you know, when we need consultants to do research, how do I expect them to have the skills? No. And I blame the companies as well. Yeah. And I've done consulting for many. I mean, I worked for this company, AdCorp, you know, the what's it called, the labor brokers. Yeah. And I told them, I said, no, you must not expect people to have skills. The companies teach the skills. Absolutely. And I'm hardcore. The education system is to educate people to be good citizens. The education system is not there to teach you how to do the work. Do you see what I'm saying? No, that is my hardcore.
I love that intervention. It reminds me of, so I had the weird encounter with the mayor of Berlin a few years ago. And I said to him, you know, we've got all of these youth employment programs and we're trying to incentivize business with tax breaks to hire young people. And he looked at me like I was a bit weird. He's like, what do you mean? I was like, so, you know, how are you incentivizing business to hire young people? He said, why would I incentivize business to hire young people? Oh. He said it's in the business's interest to bring young people in and to give young people those skills to make their businesses better. That the business. I'm
hardcore on this thing. And just one last thing. You know, I went to university in the UK, and I remember there's research that in the UK. So a lot of people I was with wanted to be chartered accountants. Many of the chartered accounting firms have done away with the requirement for a degree.
Right.
So they train you to become a chartered accountant.
That's fantastic.
And then number two is that the people who did best in those chartered accountancy exams, they didn't study accounting or BCom. They studied classics, philosophy, whatever. So you go and study philosophy.
Goodness.
And then you get trained to be an accountant.
Fantastic.
Wow. So I'm hardcore on this one.
No,
people say that the education system must prepare people for work. Nonsense. They must train people to be good citizens.
To be good thinking
citizens. Because there's this book that, the CNN presenter, he once did it. The guy from India, I just forget his name. He says, vocational education teaches you for the next job. My liberal arts education, so him coming from India, they were encouraging him to do vocational education. He says, my liberal arts education, which I got when my family moved to the US, it taught me for my 10th job. Oh, and this is what I've experienced in my education. Yes. Because when I arrived in my first job, people don't know, I worked for an accounting firm. So so that was my first job. And then the boss said, do you know how to do this? I said, no.
Definitely not.
No, definitely not. You must teach me how to do it. He says, but you've got
that thinking.
But the point is, the skills I learned critical thinking, they've helped me many years later, 10 years ago.
Absolutely.
But you're not teaching me for the next job, because a lot of those skills that you learn for the next job become obsolete here. Yeah. Yeah.
Sure.
I love that thinking. And again, when we get to the end, we're talking about solutions. I want to pick up on that. But just for us to close that loop that you opened up about what's happening with companies. So you're saying that companies, especially kind of at the manufacturing level, are not manufacturing to capacity because people can't afford, they don't have customers.
They don't have customers.
And that speaks to a kind of a vicious cycle that
Yeah.
we've created in the country. Is that the more we have a nation of people who are poor, who don't have income, the less productive we are incentivizing companies to be. Companies, why are we creating these things? Number one, if there's not a local supply for it. And number two, if the rand is so weak that even if we exported it, it's not going to matter. I mean, I think that logic for me is a really important one that not only government needs to think about, but employers also need to think about. Like companies need to think about, how do they start to intervene and at a policy level on the questions of what puts money in people's hands so that they have those customers. And I think that's where the basic income grant conversation comes in. And I want to have that conversation now because I think it's an important segue.
Absolutely.
I know both of you have been deep in conversations about the basic income grant. So I'm going to ask Lethiwe from your perspective to explain what the basic income grant is for you, and then I want Duma to take us into the mechanics of and the argument for why a basic income.
I mean, in layman terms, I suppose a basic income grant is a grant that ensures that while a young person is unemployed, they have the funds that allow them to look for work, because it is costly for one to look for work. Duma and I were talking about this earlier, if I'm not mistaken. In fact, you actually mentioned this point when we started our conversation, that it costs about 1,000 rand to look for work, right? And that is a number that was like, we as Youth Capital were able to calculate from talking to young people in 2021. We know that now that costs of living have increased, right? So a basic income grant then ensures that a young person, even though 350 is not enough, sorry, not the 350, I'm mistaking it to the social,
the
SRD,
social relief grant.
Yeah, but I mean, it ensures that a young person can actually afford to look for work and not be burdened by the cost of living. It ensures that they can be economically active and not be discouraged, and just be able to contribute to the economy. So in basic terms, that's my understanding of a basic income grant.
So, I mean, before we get into the nitty-gritties of the argument for it, people might say another grant. There's a definite view in society, even amongst unemployed people, that grants are keeping people dependent on the government, dependent on the ANC, that they're causing women to have babies so they can access the 480 child support grant. What's your view on the idea that maybe another grant is just going to take us backward?
It will not. I think it's actually another way of looking at it as social protection, right? It's that net that ensures that whether you have a child and you need grant to help you raise the child as a young person, but you have the means to live, to survive,
To stay
alive,
yeah.
right? So that's how I view it, that it's not just another grant, but it's really strengthening the social protection, because we live in a society where that is needed.
Yeah, I mean, I was saying the other day that the job of a government is to keep its people alive.
Yeah.
I mean, at bare minimum.
Yeah.
So when I first found out about the child grant, and I realized that the way the child grant came about was they were looking at how to stop children from dying of hunger. That was actually the reason why the child grant is there. So that money is meant to give a child enough money that they don't die of hunger.
Right.
So that's what you mean by social protection. It
Yeah.
protects us from the very, very worst outcomes of poverty.
Absolutely.
So Duma, let's talk about this is one of your big things.
Yeah, this is my big thing.
So Duma had me, guys, let me tell you. Duma had me read one of the longest papers I've ever read in my whole life. But it was a fascinating read about the basic income grant, or the basic income of support. So tell us what proposals are there for a basic income support? How much money would it be in comparison to other grants? But also the big question is, how would we pay for it in a country like ours where everybody's telling us we don't have money?
Okay, the first thing I have to say that the idea that the government has a financial constraint is it's propaganda. But I will not come to that later. The government doesn't have a financial constraint. Our debt ratio is not high by international standards. We've got assets in the PIC of 2.5 trillion. We've got foreign exchange reserves of.
So we have money.
Yeah, we've got money. We've got foreign exchange reserves of 1.1 trillion. We've got cash in the budget of about 300 billion. That is absolute nonsense. Yeah, but I really don't want to go into that argument. But now, I don't know how to say this, but when my father, he was born in the Eastern Cape. I won't even go into that. But his father had to sell the family cows for him to go to Lovedale. So at some points in your life, as a country or as an individual, you have to liquidate certain things to make things happen.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
You need to make a trade-off.
Yes. So my grandmother had died at the time. So he told my dad that you can't go to university. To Lovedale. In the Eastern Cape. And then I don't have the money. And then his mother appeared through a dream to my grandfather and said, "No, you've got to send this kid to school."
And invest in people.
And invest in people,
That's
yeah.
what it is.
So, and then the sad thing about it is that my father is the only one in the family who got higher education. So when you go to that township where we're from, in Kariga, he's the only one in the family who managed to go through that. And just quickly, I know that's not what you're asking. So now I was asking my dad, he was involved in education projects in the township. And I said, "Dad, and he was now the chair of the Rhodes Convocation. So I said, "Dad, have you ever seen someone from Kwanobuhle Township go to Rhodes?" He says, "Well, your niece doesn't count because she didn't school here. But I haven't seen anyone."
Wow.
So we are recycling inequality by not giving
Sure.
people these opportunities.
Absolutely.
So what I want to say is that on the basic income ground, the money, as you said, Tessa, on Twitter, the money doesn't stay in the mattress, under the mattress. People spend the money into
And
the
people also don't eat the coins.
They don't eat the coins.
Eat the notes.
Yeah, so I calculated that about half of the money would come back to the government. For
Gotcha.
example, through VAT, through a stimulus to the economy. It's a short-term
And
stimulus.
what money are you proposing? How much are you
Okay,
proposing
so
in a grant?
I propose that it must be big. So it must be, there's 3 official poverty lines. There's the food poverty line, the lower poverty line, the upper poverty line. So the upper one is about 1,500. So I'm saying let's have a big for adults, 18 to 59, and that child grant, let's have another one for the child grant. So if you're a mother of 3 children, you'll get 3 grants of 1,500 for your 3 children, and then you'll get one for yourself.
Right.
So the cost of this thing was 547 billion over 3 years.
Now, what I like about that calculation, because I saw a statistic the other day, or a number the other day, about the cost of a food basket.
Yeah.
And so it was showing that the cost of a food basket in South Africa, if you want to feed a family of a few people, is about 5,000 rand.
Yeah.
And so if you had a big that actually looked at 3 people in a household or 4 people in a household, that actually it's the equivalent of a food basket.
Yes,
People
yes,
could
yes.
actually afford a proper food basket.
So I call it a first dignity floor below which no one should.
dignity
Yeah,
floor.
which
I've
no one
never heard that before.
should go below. And then obviously, Tessa, it's not sustainable its own. So you must do many other things to get our economy growing.
Right.
We must have all these programs of the government. I added them all up. The public employment. The shocking thing is that in the budget, the presidential employment stimulus ends 2 months before the election, in March next year. This SRD grant ends in March, 2 months before an election. What were they thinking, when they do that? So this one, those imperfect opportunities that Lethiwe was talking about, they're going to end them. Yeah. So I'm saying let's amalgamate all these public employment programs, and let's also give a job guarantee to our people and our young people. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing you say is that it's not just about giving people money,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
Number one, as you're saying, at least half of that money we need to make sure gets back into the fiscus.
Yes, yes, yes.
So you're giving people 1,500, but you're hoping you must make sure actually that 700 of that gets back into
Yes, it
you
will,
know
yeah,
the
yeah,
tax collection. That's one. But you're also saying that it must be supported by other things, right? So where are you going to spend that money? Are you going to spend it all at ShopRite, or are you going to spend it in the
that's
local
a great.
economy?
Yeah, that's the question. Now,
Or-
if
yeah?
we have, this is the government that we have, not the one that we wish we had. Now, if it was a proper government, like in Brazil,
one we wish we had.
the one we wish we had, we would give them vouchers so that in Eldos you can spend it in local communities.
There we go.
But now, in this government that we have, do you think, Tessa, they can actually pull that one off?
So it's the question
Because the
of-
food parcels for COVID, they were stolen through corruption. But the point is, there are ways. I believe every new government spending program, whether it's for renewable energy, whether it's for grants, you must try and maximize the multiplier effects in the economy.
So
I was
every time
talking
you
to
spend, you must make from that.
you must make from that, and I remember we were sitting with my work colleague Isabel, with Sipho Maseko, the then CEO of trying to get his support from Telkom, and he says, government spends, you must create opportunities for people to benefit from this spending.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
I think one of the things you often say is that government budgets aren't like household budgets.
Yes.
You're not just getting an income so that you spend that income, and then that income, you never feel like you ever see
It
the income
circulates
again.
in the economy, yeah,
Yes,
yes.
government's money must circulate. And in fact, it's people who make money. People who will make that money more. People will then create businesses, or they will create opportunities, or they will build things, or they will create better homes for themselves.
Tessa, it's the last thing I want to say
Yeah.
so before Lethiwe comes in. Look, I've had the pleasure of going on study trips to China. The Chinese get it. That they don't look, I think they've got a problem in their language about money. So they, like numbers, they get confused with numbers. But anyway, on a lighter note, so they understand that if you spend money, it circulates in the economy. So
Yeah.
I had the pleasure of being on their bullet train from Beijing to Shanghai. They spent, after the global financial crisis, $300 billion to the bullet train to create you are on that thing for 10 minutes, and then you realize what enormous benefits for this economy.
Absolutely. I mean,
It's like you just don't have to even think about it. And they've now connected 30,000 kilometers. They make a huge financial loss, the state-owned company, but there's an economic benefit for the country. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think the last point I'll make on this as well. So there's a young man in the last year who I've interacted with who's been struggling with homelessness. And my experience with this guy has really just made me think so differently about this. Because when I think about the basic income grant, the first thing I now think about is the ability to have a home. Because what haunts me is, he said to me, if I don't have a home, how will I ever get a job?
Yeah.
And if at least we have infrastructure spending and a social wage that gives us the kind of environment where we can have dignity to work, then we're getting somewhere. But if we're too afraid to spend on anything, we're actually not going to get the human development we need for the economic development, yeah? So Lethiwe, that brings me back to the social capital question. So
Right.
you were explaining that young people need social capital, and we're firmly now into the solutions part of this thing.
Right.
So what does social capital look like? So you were saying, if a young person gets into a job, they're in a network. I know that when I think about my own experience,
Yeah.
I realized two things. One, my mother's never worked a high-paying job, right? So she started working when she was about 15. She finished working when she was about 65. In that time, she'd never clocked more than 10,000 Rand a month in her salary. But I know that my mother has gotten so many people jobs. Like, my mother has never stopped with, here's a job here, there's a position there, here's an opportunity here, here's an opportunity there.
Right.
And that hasn't even just made my life better, it's made the life of our family better, it's made the life of communities better. And so that's what you're talking about when you're talking about social capital.
Absolutely. And I want to highlight, just want to stress how important it is, in addition to what you've said. We found that at any given time, 6 in 10 people find a job because of someone they know, right? So who you know, and I know that that statement can be mistaken for nepotism, and that's not what we're referring to here. But who you know in terms of what knowledge they have because of where they're working really helps you as a young person kind of progress and really make progress in your life, right? But it's also not just about people who can point you to an opportunity, help you apply for that opportunity. When we talk about social capital, it's also about having the know-how, so like sort of tricks of the trade, right?
Yeah.
Someone who can tell you, hey, this is how you need to better structure your CV. I may
Right.
not be able to point you to a job opportunity, but I can advise you on how better to present yourself, quote unquote, sell yourself as a young person. But then there's also other needs that you have as a young person. I mean, one major need that I have encountered in my interactions with young people is not having the clothes to work. So like not even just interview, but like when you start working, right? And we know that when you have a strong network of people who can say, you know what, here's a two-piece that you can wear for your interview, and then there's also, just a last thing to say, there's also the confidence that can be built through social capital, right? Where when you are exposed, because that's another word associated to social capital, being exposed.
Exposure, yep.
Right? When you are exposed to the world of work, there's a level of confidence that you get as a young person when you walk into the world of work. You don't shy away from raising your hand in the office, because that also can help you progress when you start working.
Absolutely. I mean, one of my
stand out,
favorite youth employment programs in the country is Chrysalis Academy
Right.
in the Western Cape. Just my favorite, and I haven't even been there in person, but watching their story and having one of my own family members go through that program. Their focus in their program, number one, it's a residential program, which I don't have enough of, where a young person is in person for 3 months, learning skills, learning about aptitude, learning about themselves. But the focus there is also psychosocial support.
Right.
Working through trauma, working on self-esteem, working on all of that. Because the one thing that young people have said to me over the years, over and over again, is that these years and years and years of unemployment that young people are facing knocks their self-esteem and their sense of worth. And that's, if you're now coming from a family where there's violence, or a community where there's abuse, or you're coming from trauma generally, and now you come to a workplace that also beats you down and says you're not good enough. I think we have a generation of young people in front of us who need more than just a job.
Yeah.
They need some emotional support. Yeah,
And that can definitely be experienced when a young person has a good social network, a strong support system. And we actually ran a campaign, because oftentimes we talk about social capital and we say that it's a low-hanging fruit in terms of how you can support a young person. People have said, well, what is that? What action should I take, right? And so we ran a campaign as Youth Capital last year, and we actually have a publication on our website titled LinkedIn, where we speak about different actions ordinary South Africans can take to build a young person's social capital. Reach out to the young person that you already know, offer to be their coach, offer to be their mentor. And mentorship, I know, can be such a loaded, pregnant word. It's like, okay, what does that mean? And at times it's as simple as talking on WhatsApp and sharing tips on WhatsApp.
absolutely.
I really would encourage the viewers, the listeners, to have a look at the publication LinkedIn on our website and just see the different actions that you can take to strengthen a young person's social network.
Cool. So the last 2 minutes or so, I just wanted us to talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, because we haven't spoken about that a lot. And people will say to me, well, you guys just want grants. You don't want young people to work. But on that, Duma, one of the things that I also think is connected to the social capital thing is I noticed that having worked with entrepreneurs for a while now, that the most successful entrepreneurs, especially young entrepreneurs, are people who've had a job before. And we are out here saying to young people who've never worked, become an employer.
Right.
Go from I've never worked a day in my life to run your own company. What can we and should we be thinking about a lot more practically around the question of entrepreneurship?
I feel so strongly about that, because it's complete madness to ask a person who's never worked before. It's a excuse for you not to provide. That's not the English, but the government can't provide jobs, so you must go and become an entrepreneur. Now, I follow this very closely, and then the sad reality is that our institutions of support to young people and all people are inadequate. If you just add up, there's 3 institutions: Small Enterprise Finance Agency, you've got the National Empowerment Fund, and then for larger businesses, you've got the IDC.
And then you can add the NYDA.
And then the NYDA, but the NYDA is exited that, and that portfolio has now been taken by CIFA. But they do certain things, So if you just add it all together, which I did, it was about 3.7 billion rands to support the whole country.
In entrepreneurship support.
The entrepreneurship support, So, and then if you look at the demand, there's been a survey done by the IFC, International Finance Corporation. The credit gap in South Africa, it's $30 billion. That's almost $500 million rands, $500 billion rands. That's the credit gap. And then we're providing 3.7 billion rands for everybody throughout South Africa to set up their own businesses.
But the president said you only need 300
ice
rand and
cream,
you can start an ice cream income. What are you talking about?
So now I've added up all the support that we give to the IDC, everybody, and it adds up to about what we call 0.2% of GDP. And the last thing, I had during Christmas, I was doing a survey of people in the informal sector. And I went into downtown and I interviewed certain people. I was in a city, basically is a slum in Johannesburg, But none of them had ever met anyone from the city of Joburg. The city of Joburg has no budget. They say that the city of Joburg has got no budget, and to support them.
Support them, to give infrastructure.
So what they need infrastructure. They were telling me that the sewage system in the center of Johannesburg is collapsed. If there's rain, the whole place gets flooded, and
that's just basic services. That's not even entrepreneurship support.
Yes, they need.
That's just toilets.
And then we saw all the small businesses are shocked that there's a different class of businesses in downtown Joburg. Some have got generators, and some don't.
Maboneng.
Maboneng
versus what's the
North?
Not North.
I was in Bree Street.
So the Bree Street North area. I was thinking about a particular place now that.
I know the place,
Oh, my,
so
my,
I'm
yes.
thinking Maboneng versus my.
But so Maboneng is now slum as well,
Your definition of slum we must work on. But the bar is also low for that. So, Lethiwe, your ideas around and view around entrepreneurship and young people?
I share the same frustration that Duma just expressed in that, there's this expectation placed on young people to now become job creators by starting their own businesses. And as Youth Capital, we're saying that not every young person is made up for becoming an entrepreneur.
Sure.
Right? And it's not just simply about taking 350 and starting an ice cream store. There's so much to it. From the entrepreneurs that we have engaged with, they tell us that the cost of starting a business is not even just financial cost. There are other costs attached to starting a business. And these other so-called invisible costs of starting a business, having the right place to start a business, being in a place where there is a demand for your business, all of these factors are not included in the support that is given to young people who do decide to become entrepreneurs. And so we really need to look at the support that is given to young people who do decide, but also not, preach this gospel that every young person should become an entrepreneur.
No, I agree. So Duma, you want to add something?
Just one last thing. So internationally, it has been shown that 90% of people prefer a job. And only 10% are mad enough to become entrepreneurs. And
that's a fair point, right? Also because, like you said, the skill set to be an entrepreneur is not for everyone. But I want us to end off in like 30 seconds to a minute each by you answering a question I did not prepare you for. But it's one of my favorite questions. So if you guys, there's a cabinet reshuffle in the next few days. And if the president says, you know what, Duma, you know what, Lethiwe, you're the Minister of Employment in this country, or the Minister of Economic Development, or the Minister of Finance. You can pick one. But if you could do one intervention around youth employment from the government side, what do you think your main intervention would be and why?
Okay, my first one, just to get this economy going again, I'd put a basic income grant. But it must be supported with other complementary policies, the ones that we've been talking about, entrepreneurship, job creation, and so forth, so that it circulates more in our community.
Yeah. Cool. Lethiwe, your big one?
That's a difficult question, but I think I want to go back to a point I made earlier about public employment programs, in that also there needs to be a better partnership between civil society organizations and public employment programs. So not only a better partnership between the public sector and the private sector, but also between public sector, private sector, and civil society, right? Because a lot of the young people who that join the public employment programs are often are part of civil society organizations, so they can be trained up even there to kind of prepare them to be part of the public employment. So yeah, just a better policy that speaks to that collaboration
between private sector, government, and civil society.
Yeah.
So that leads me to actually mine as well. So if I was president, but particularly if I was kind of the Minister of Social Development or the Minister of Labour, the one place where I think we have not tapped into jobs in this country is community development and the care economy.
Right.
There are so many young people who wake up every day to work for their communities, to work for their families, to provide support to the elderly, to provide safety, to provide so many things in their communities. And those young people in the main tell you, I've never been employed.
And yet they've been working.
And they've been working. And like young people, when we were doing things around CVs, young people would say, I have no job experience. Then I say, okay, what do you do every day? Oh, I fixed my neighbor's fence yesterday. Oh no, we're planting a vegetable garden. I'm like, all of that is stuff that we must start to value.
Sure.
And so as we end up our discussion today, I want to thank you so much for your insights. This has been really, really more than I bargained for in terms of a conversation with a lot of knowledge. And I hope that as you've been listening to this conversation today, that you've really been thinking about not only what those job employment numbers mean, but what some of the things that we should be fighting for in our society to get things moving forward. A lot of time we spend a lot of our time fighting young people about not working, but we're not necessarily fighting for young people to have a country that works for them. And so if anything, I hope this conversation helps us think about that together and create the South Africa we all deserve. We will see you in the next podcast episode. Bye-bye.